The year is 1759. British Parliament has been sitting on a problem for 45 years. Ships are dying. Merchant vessels, naval frigates, exploration craft, sailing into the Atlantic and the Pacific and the Indian Oceans and failing to come home because the captains don't know where they are. Specifically, they can't solve longitude, they can't solve and calculate latitude, they have no idea how far north or south they are from the sun. Longitude, how far east or west, knowing the exact time back from home. And no clock made in 1759 can keep accurate time through weeks at sea. The rolling of the ship, the changes in temperature, the humidity, the constant vibrations, these destroy the rates of even the finest mechanical timepieces of the time. In 1714, the British Parliament passed the Longitude Act, and it offered a prize of £20,000, the equivalent of roughly £3 million today, to anyone who could solve this problem. And the prize went unclaimed for decades. And in 1759, a self-taught clockmaker from Lincolnshire named John Harrison, he delivered to the Board of Longitude an object the size of a large pocket watch. It had taken him 17 years to build it, and he called it the H4. And the H4 kept time on a sea voyage to the West Indies within 5 seconds over 81 days. 5 seconds across an entire ocean. Harrison solved the longitude problem. A British watchmaker working alone with hand tools in the 18th century. That's where this story is going to start.
In a small back room by the bench, a file, a loop, and a patient hand.
Welcome back to What's on Your Wrist Day. I'm Wachowski, and before I begin, I want to say hello and welcome to the listeners that we have in different countries. Obviously, the ones in the United States, but we also have folks listening from Japan, Ireland, Costa Rica, Canada, Australia, Switzerland, Belgium, the United Kingdom. And so if you are listening in one of those countries, just know that I appreciate you listening. I appreciate being able to share this across, oceans and continents. And if you share this to other folks in other countries, I genuinely appreciate it. It means a lot. And the fact that this storytelling that I get to do in Southern California, which was a crazy idea, is being shared across the world it's humbling. And it's just a reminder that there are a few folks out there that enjoy this kind of stuff as well. And so just know that we are a small but mighty tribe, and I appreciate you all, and I appreciate you sharing it with folks that you care about. Just know it means a lot. So let's get into what's on your Reese Day for, boy, oh boy, I cannot believe this is our 18th episode. So we've spent the last, 3 episodes outside of Switzerland. We talked about tool watches, American watches. We were in Japan for 2 episodes, right? And today we're going to stay outside Switzerland, just one more time. We're going to go somewhere that for me has particular resonance. We're going to Britain, and not because British watchmaking is the biggest story in the hobby right now. It isn't. Not because British, and specifically Britain, has the most brands or the deepest infrastructure or the largest output, but because Britain's history in this craft is extraordinary. And because the modern revival, quiet, small, and I love to use this word for my British brothers and sisters out there, stubborn in the most respectful way I can say it. They're producing some of the most interesting watchmaking right now. So settle in. We're going to go into telling you a story here. So segment 1, we're going to call The Line, Harrison, Mudge, and Daniels. So let me give you the shape of what Britain and specifically their contribution to horology is, because I think most watch enthusiasts, even serious ones, may not fully see it. And it took me a little while to even gather the information for this episode. Britain gave the watch world 3 foundational inventions, and they span across 3 centuries. The first, the marine chronometer. John Harrison, 1759. I just told you that story in kind of my open. The H4 solved the longitude problem. It made global navigation reliable. It changed the course of tradition, exploration, and empire. And it was built by a clockmaker from a small English town who had almost no formal education. The H4 is now in the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, and guess what? It still runs. The second was the lever escapement, right? a watchmaker named Thomas Mudge. It's Mudge. He invented it in 1755 in a roughly the same era as Harrison. The lever escapement replaced the kind of verge escapement that had powered mechanical watches for like 3 centuries. And it's a system of pallets and forks on these kind of banking pins that regulate the release of energy to the balance wheel. And virtually like every modern mechanical watch that we have, it's that tick and tock that we see. So every Swiss lever escapement, even in like Rolex, every Patek, every AP, every Omega, is basically a direct descendant of Thomas Mudge's invention. He's an Englishman and the 18th century. And again, forgotten outside of like the horological world, but present in on roughly a billion wrists, right? And the third is going to be the coaxial escapement. A watchmaker named George Daniels, working alone in London in like the second half of the 20th century, developed an escapement that delivers energy to the balance wheel in a way that reduces sliding friction. So most escapements work through this sliding contact. The pallet pushes against the escape wheel and specifically the escape wheel teeth. And Daniels's coaxial design uses kind of like a combination of direct impulse and then separate coaxial wheels to significantly reduce this friction. And obviously, less friction means longer service intervals. So you might go from something that has like a 5 year interval or a 3 to 5 year interval to 10 or 15 years, right? And Omega licensed this design in 1999, and it's now the only alternative escapement in widespread commercial production. So, three inventions. Harrison's chronometer made the seas navigatable. Mudge's lever escapement is inside of basically every mechanical watch made today. And Daniels's coaxial escapement is inside of pretty much every modern Omega. All British. And there is a fourth thing Britain contributed, which is not really an invention, but like a person. George Daniels. Working alone in the 20th century when British commercial watchmaking had almost entirely collapsed, Daniels kept making watches by hand, like complete watches from raw metal to finished pieces by one person using traditional methods. Again, the Daniels method. The complete individual fabrication of a watch was something Daniels essentially reinvented as a deliberate artistic and horological statement. He made 56 watches and approximately, I think, 32 pocket watches in his career, every one of them by hand, alone in his workshop. And when Daniels passed in 2011, he left his workshop to his only apprentice. And that apprentice is who we need to talk about first. So, segment two, we're going to talk about Roger W. Smith, the last keeper. He was born in 1970 in Bolton, and it's a town in kind of greater Manchester. And he grew up, in his own words, with no interest in academic subjects whatsoever. What he had was kind of this talent for making things with his hands. So at 16, his father suggested that he, enroll in the Manchester School of Horology, and he did, and he finished top of his class, and he won the British Horological Institute's Bronze Medal Award, and it was given to him as the most outstanding graduate student of the year. So don't assume that bronze medal means that he got third, right? The bronze medal is the most outstanding graduate student of the year. And during that time at the institute, George Daniels came to speak, and Roger Smith said that from the moment he heard Daniels talk about watchmaking and what it could be, the idea of one person, raw materials, complete creation, he knew that that was his path. And so he left the institution and spent years teaching himself to make watches by hand, using Daniels' own book, again, the book named Watchmaking, as his guide. His first attempt at a pocket watch, including this 1 minute tourbillon and a detent escapement, it took him 18 months to complete. He took it to Daniels on the Isle of Man, and Daniels turned it over, studied it, and said, in what has become kind of one of the greatest lines in modern watchmaking, go back and start again. It looks too handmade. Not poorly made, not technically deficient, it looked too handmade, meaning the watch had evidence of the hand was still visible in a way that it should not be. A truly well-made watch, finished to the standard Daniels required, should look inevitable. Like it could never have been made any other way. And this is humbling, I think, for me as well as someone who works with students. I'll give you an example. When I was doing my doctoral studies and I had written what I would consider my first complete draft of my dissertation, and the document was almost 500 pages. I gave it to my dissertation chair, and I thought he was going to say, this is the most beautiful piece of literature and prose and essay that I've ever read, right? And what I got back was, "I like it, now make it shorter." As in, cut it down to if you can get it into the 200 to 250 page range. No one's gonna read your thing. So it's kind of one of those reminders of, I think it was Mark Twain or someone has quoted Mark Twain in saying, he wrote his friend a 3-page paper, and at the end he says, "If I would have had more time, I would have made it shorter." As in, it's very difficult to get to the point. It's very simple to ramble on. And I think what was happening here between Daniels and Roger was profound. It was a teacher mentoring, right? It was this moment of, I'm not doing this because I dislike you. I'm doing it because I want to show you the right way to do this. And sometimes if you're thinking of sports analogies, it means you're grabbing someone's face mask and you're getting in their face a little bit and you're coaching them and you're saying, this is what you're going to do. And then you go do it, right? Now, again, not poorly made, just not there, too handmade. So Roger went back and he spent the next 5.5 years making his second pocket watch, making it and remaking it, rebuilding sections as he improved his skills. 4 times he went back and rebuilt parts of the movement. And then finally in 1997, he took it to the Isle of Man again, and Daniels held the watch, looked at it closely, and asked, "Who made the case?" And Roger said, "I did." And Daniels asked him, "Who made the dial?" And Roger said, "I did." "And who made the escapement wheel?" "Also, I did." "And who made this tourbillon cage?" Response, "I did." Daniels closed the back of the watch, stood up, and said, "Congratulations, you're a watchmaker." Roger moved to the Isle of Man that year, and he worked alongside Daniels on the Millennium wristwatch series. The first production watches that used Daniels' co-axial escapement in partnership with Omega. And after the Millennium project concluded, Roger opened his own studio in 2001, making watches under his own name. Now, when Daniels passed in 2011, October 2011, he bequeathed his entire workshop to Roger Smith, the lathes, the tools, the hand engine turning equipment. Some of that stuff dates back to like the 1820s, and the workshop had been home to the most significant watchmaker in the 20th century. And now it was the home of the only person that Daniels had ever fully trained. The workshop today is on the Isle of Man. It's a small island in the Irish Sea between Britain and Ireland. It's best known for like motorcycle races and some offshore banking, and occasionally you get a cyclist that's kind of awesome from there as well. And Roger Smith, his small team, his 15 to 20 watches per year, and every component made by hand in the studio, every dial engine turned in silver, every bridge hand beveled, hand polished, heat blued hands. The series he makes are called the Series 1 through the Series 6, and each offer a different complication or displays architecture, from time only through like power reserves and open dials and traveling date apertures and more. And they're all usually within the 34 or 38 to 40 millimeter. They're all made by Daniels' method, and they start well above 150,000 pounds. And the wait times are now approaching, I think, 3 years at the time of this recording. Convert those to US dollars and it gets real pricey. Now, Roger Smith was awarded an OBE, which is the Order of British Empire, in 2018 for services to British watchmaking. Here's what I want you to understand about Roger Smith. He's not just a watchmaker making expensive watches on this like remote island. He is the custodian of tradition. The British, or the tradition of British precision horology, the one that produced Harrison and Mudge and Daniels, it almost died in the 20th century. Like, commercial British watchmaking is essentially gone. What Roger Smith does in that workshop with these tools is the living continuation of something that would have otherwise only existed in museums. So every year, 15 watches leave that island, and the tradition continues on for one more year. And that is, in my view, one of the most quietly important things that's ever happened in watchmaking today. And again, people talk about the names and the brands and the watches, but they don't talk about the history or the story behind it. And so I hope that these stories land with you. Segment 3, I'm going to get into Christopher Ward. I'm going to call this the disruptor section. Okay. Now, I want to take you completely in a different direction, somewhere totally different. Same country, but completely different energy, right? In May 2004, on a boat on the River Thames, right? Three friends, all entrepreneurs, all watch enthusiasts, but none of them watchmakers. Mike France and Peter Ellis, they just sold their company. a British educational toy retailer that they called it was for the early learning center. They had money and energy and this kind of post-exit restlessness, which I think if any of us are business owners, and those of you that have done this before, and any businesses, my wife and I have sold businesses. You don't just sell businesses typically and just stop. The entrepreneurial spirit doesn't ever die. And so it just gets redirected or reframed. And they had a third friend called Chris Ward. And again, no relation to the watch industry, just a man whose name happened to sound very English. And the three of them spent that afternoon on the river talking about watches, specifically why a well made watch that had to cost so much more than its components and manufacturer kind of justified. And the answer they landed on was the retail supply chain, the layers of distribution, regional importers, these authorized dealer networks, the boutiques, and marketing budgets. They all sat between with the factory and the buyer's wrist. So they had a question. And again, I love questions. And this is the question that these guys came up with. What if you cut all of that out? And the name they kept, named the company was Christopher Ward because as Mike France says, kind of in early interviews, it sounded the most typical English of all of their three names. And so they were humble enough to be able to put someone else's name on the die. And the company launched in 2005 as the world's first exclusively online luxury watch retailer. So no boutiques, no authorized dealers, no celebrity ambassadors, just direct to consumer watches that were at a price that reflected what the watches kind of actually costed to make. Now, early operations were run from literally a chicken shed in Berkshire. By the time they were making some serious money, they were merging with their Swiss manufacturing partners and a company called Synergies. And they're kind of run by the Bader family in Beale and developing their own in house calibers and SH21 in conjunction with watchmaker named Johannes Janka. And now, today, Christopher Ward is British in design and ownership, but really Swiss manufacturer. Watches are designed in England, but they're made in Switzerland. So the cases, dials, movements are all produced in Beale. And then the design direction, the brand's voice, and the customer relationship, that all comes from, it's all coming from the British. And the lineup covers a ton of ground. The C60 Trident dive line, the C65 vintage inspired dress pieces, the C63 Sealander GMT, the C1 Moon Glow, Moon Phase, and then the watch that kind of changed the entire concept of the conversation was the C1 Bel Canto. Now, the Bel Canto is a chiming watch. Specifically, it's this sonnerie passage, and it's fascinating. It's a watch that chimes the passing of each hour, but it's not a minute repeater. You don't push a button to trigger it. At the top of every hour, the watch chimes automatically on a D note. So it's sounding like the number of the hours have passed, and it's kind of this really fascinating movement architecture. It runs on something called the FS01, and it was developed with Yanka, the complications team there, and it was calibrated to strike with a quality of sound that, with a watch in this price point, it genuinely surprised people to hear it for the first time. The Bel Canto launched in November 2022, and the first 300 pieces they immediately sold out. In November of 2023, the Grand Prix in Geneva, it's kind of, again, the Oscars of watchmaking. The C1 Bel Canto won the Petite Aiguille Award, it's the prize for the best watch priced between 2,000 and 8,000 Swiss francs. A British brand making watches designed in England and built in Switzerland beat Bulgari and Tudor and a room full of much older, much more prestigious houses to win watchmaking's most recognized international competition. And it was for the first time a British brand had ever won at the GPHG. Now, if I want you to feel the weight of that for a second, Christopher Ward is 20 years old. Their workshop started in a chicken shed. Their co founder is a man who used to run a toy company, and they just beat established Swiss watch industry at its own ceremony. Mike France, in his acceptance speech, said, "This is a victory for the whole of UK horology." And he wasn't wrong. A note before I leave Christopher Ward. The co-founder Chris Ward himself left the company in 2020, and the brand continues under Mike France and Peter Ellis. And the direction, the quality, the community, they're all intact. But it's worth noting that if you look up the brand for the first time, that Chris Ward himself isn't a part of the affiliation for that brand anymore. Now, in segment 4, we're going to get into Fears and then Garrick, crafted in Bristol and Norfolk. Let me get into two brands that most of us listeners haven't heard of, hopefully you have with Fears because I've discussed them in the past, and I have a real soft spot for Fears. And then both of these are brands that I think you need to get to know a little bit better. So Fears, Fears, based in Bristol, founded by Nicholas Bowman Scargill, and carrying the name of the original Fears watch company. Again, established in 1846, that makes Fears the oldest surviving British watch brand name over 170 years of horological presence, if you count, the lineage. Now, the modern Fears watches are small production, carefully made, anchored in traditional British watch language. They have clean dials, hand finished cases. They are beautifully proportioned. And we mentioned Fears, I think, briefly in episode 2 of the show, right when I was getting started. And I think they deserve a little bit more attention than what they got then. What makes Fears particularly interesting to talk about like today is a piece that they made in collaboration with Garrick, and it's Garrick. The Fears Garrick is a time-only watch that featured a handmade in-house movement, a 42 millimeter case that was finished in Norfolk, and a production run of just fewer than like 5 pieces per year. There's 2 build slots available annually with a delivery time that stretches well into a couple of years. And this is basically as micro production gets. Garrick itself deserves kind of its own moment. Now, founded in 2014 by David Brailsford and Simon Mickelmeyer in Norfolk, England, they make a maximum of about 50 watches per year. Now, the dials, hands, and significant movement components are all made in house in their Norfolk workshop. Cases are manufactured locally and then they finish them in house. And the characteristic Garrick aesthetic is this kind of guild type dial layout, has this anchor profile hands. They're thermally blued by hand over a flame, and the guild inspired bridge design is deeply English in reference. Now, and this is the detail I've been waiting to kind of mention since like episode 12 of the show. The Garrick in house movement, the UTG01, which also powers the Fears Garrick, was designed in partnership with Andreas Streller. Now, if you listen to episode 12, you'll recognize that name. Andreas Streller was one of the watchmakers working at R&P, Renault and Papi, in the Lock in like the late 1990s and early 2000s. The same workshop that produced Grubel Forsey and the Gronefelds, Streller went on to design complications for major watch complication designers. And then somehow he found his way to collaborate with 2 men in Norfolk who were building tiny quantities of hand finished English watches. So the bloodline of modern independent watchmaking that we can trace all the way back to like episode 12, it's going to show up in a 2 building operation on the English coast. And again, the watch world is very, very small. And again, that's why I want to share these stories with you, is because I feel like the more that we can share them, I think even though we are a small but mighty community, we are small. And I think these stories deserve to be told. Now, Garrick produces their watches can start, at a very entry level of about 2,500 pounds, and then they can go very much higher above that. They have hand wound Unitas 6497 movements that are based, and then they finish them up to Garrick standards. And they have these bespoke, complicated pieces that go well above that price range. And again, maximum of about 50 per year. Every one of them is built to order. And again, don't hold me to the prices because as the time of this recording, they can you never know what happens with prices these days. Segment 5, I'm going to talk about my brief mentions. I'm going to talk about Bremont and Smiths, and then also a brand that I think maybe folks have never heard of before, which is going to be Frodsham. Okay, so 3 brands that I want to get into. Bremont, founded in 2002 by Nicholas and Giles English, and they were the first British watch company to build at like a genuine scale and had kind of this manufacturing facility wing. They had 35,000 square feet on, I believe it was on the Henley on Thames, and they opened that in 2021, and they had like real military contracts with the Ministry of Defense. The triptych case that they had, it was this 3-part hardened steel barrel assembly, and it was like genuinely anti-shock, and it was a legitimate engineering innovation. The English brothers, they built something I think meaningful. I also have to be honest about where the brand sits right now because this podcast deals in like current reality. Nick and Giles English, they stepped down from the board in April of 2025, and the brand was taken over by an American billionaire, Bill Ackman. He acts as the new CEO, and David Serrato, Cerrato, formerly of like Tudor and Montblanc. He's their new acting CEO. And they're 2024, they had a rebrand, a new logo, the Terra Nova collection, a departure from the triptych cases. And it was met with this significant community backlash. And the brand basically posted these operating losses of £10 million in their 2024 year. And the story itself is unresolved. I think Braemont may work to kind of find its footing under its new leadership, or it may not. And so I tell folks to kind of watch this space. Now, the English brothers, they built something real. What it becomes is going to be a different question for probably another episode, maybe years from now. Now, Smiths and Time Factors, some of you have been waiting for this one since like episode 3. You know I am biased towards Smiths and Time Factors and Eddie and Dave. The Smiths Everest that I wore when my son was born is very special to me, and that one was stolen, and it's been subsequently replaced with one very, very similar. And the Smiths Watch Company was one of Britain's most important mid century manufacturers. They made everything from military issue watches to the Smiths Everest, the watch Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay wore on the first ascent of Everest in 1953. The British watch industry largely died in like the 1970s, and Smith's commercial watch production ended. Now, what kept them alive was something special, right? And what allowed me to own a Smith's Everest on my wrist to the present day is the fact that these people have brought back this brand. And so, having these continuation watches under historically British brands and specifically the Smiths name using what I would hope would be kind of similar case sizes and dimensions. And again, I always tell folks this, the Time Factor Smiths Everest is not a replica. I argue that it's a continuation of a genuine British watch. And in some instances, depending on the models that you get, some of them are hand wound, some of them are using Swiss movements, and they're fascinating watches. Again, they're not necessarily cheap, and I say this in like the most respectful way possible. They're inexpensive watches that are made very, very well, but they don't cost a lot. And I think that's fascinating again in this time and space and stuff. And so just depending on where you get them, I think they're just really special little pieces that you can add to your collection. Again, my bias comes through and all that kind of stuff because I have a connection to the brand and I also have a connection to the specific watches that I've worn in very significant moments in my life. So again, the idea that people want to wear a Smith's Everest is that you don't want to wear it in a 36 millimeter example is how I would wear it. Now, that watch again, it's in my collection and it was there before I started this podcast and it was there when I was thinking about making this podcast, and it was on my wrist when my son came into this world. And I don't know how anybody could love a watch or a brand more than that when those things are kind of connected. Now, we're going to get to Charles Fordsham real quick. He's a historical London clockmaker and it's a watchmaking firm. They were established in the 1820s and they had quietly continued into the modern era, making extremely limited quantities of traditionally hand finished watches, but also clocks. And that's probably why you haven't heard of them. And if you're the kind of person who wants a hand finished English watch with like 2 centuries of lineage, I'll just tell you, and I'll end this kind of section here, that Frodsham, it's Frodsham, is kind of a name to know. Just look them up. Okay, now segment 6, let's get into the thesis of what this is, and let's pull it all together, and we'll end this section as the thesis, what the British revival is. So here's what the British watchmaking revival is and what it is not. Now, if you look at like, British watchmakers and the organization that they've become and the community of band of brothers and sisters that they're building and their annual events that they have, you see that something is building and it's pretty amazing. Now, it is not Switzerland. It doesn't have the infrastructure, it doesn't have the supply chain. It it doesn't have the industry density and the centuries of scale production, and I don't think it ever will. And I don't think it's trying to become Switzerland. And I think if they try to become Switzerland, I think that's the wrong ambition. But it's not America. The American revival is a story of an industry that's being rebuilt brand by brand, movement by movement, supply chain components by components. Britain's situation is different. There is no American equivalent of Roger Smith, keeping the flame burning alone with these decades of historical achievements, right? When everything else went quiet, there was just this one person. I would argue that the British revival is instead, it's a continuation but it's also reimagination. A single watchmaker on an island in the Irish Sea working with tools from the 1820s, producing 15 watches a year in the direct tradition of the greatest British watchmaker of the 20th century. A brand that was launched on a riverboat and a Berkshire chicken shed that just won watchmaking's most recognized international competition with a chiming watch that costs like £3,500. A two-person operation in Norfolk making 50 watches a year, collaborating on movements with an alum from Leloch's workshop that produced Grubel Forsey. None of those things are the same story, but they share a quality. They are done by people who do not need permission to love this craft. Harrison was not formally trained as a clockmaker. You know this from our episodes in Japan. Roger Smith was rejected by Daniels the first time. Mike France used to run a toy company. The Garrick founders, they showed up in Norfolk and started, making watches. So Britain's contribution to horology has always come from people who ignored what was supposed to be possible. Harrison loved and solved this longitude challenge when the scientific establishment said it couldn't be done with a mechanical clock. Daniels invented the coaxial escapement when Swiss manufacturers weren't interested. Roger Smith kept the Daniels method alive when it would have been much easier for them to, financially just find a sensible place to stop. And that's where I'm going to go with this. I'm going to say that they're stubborn individuals. There is a stubborn individualism for my brothers and sisters in England. That willingness to work on something that nobody asks for because it matters to you, it matters to them. It's much more, I think, in line with what we're seeing with our brothers in Japan. Their sisters in Japan, with our brothers in the US. It's not about these defining characteristics of the specific watch. They're defining characteristics of the British tradition, not scale, not prestige, commitment. And that is, in the end, I think what this hobby's about. The watches that matter the most are made by the people who just couldn't help themselves to stop making them. They wanted to make them. Now, segment 7, let's talk about what's next. I'm going to tease episode 19, and I'm going to tell you right now, I'm going to give you kind of a little teaser. FP Journe. This one is the show that I think we've been trying to earn since like episode 13, and I didn't think I was ready to discuss it yet. Next episode, we're going to go back to Switzerland. We're going to go back to Geneva specifically, to one of those people who just couldn't stop. Since episode 13 of this show, since the episode of Recepi, there has been a name sitting in the background of like everything. The man who trained Recep, the watchmaker whose operational philosophy Recep absorbed and made the foundation of Akrivia. The man who, when asked which young watchmaker he admired most, said one word and then added with a smile, especially now that he stopped copying me. We're going to talk about Francois Paul Journe, who goes by FP Journe. FP Journe is, by the reckoning of the most serious collectors and the most serious watchmaking journalists, the most important living watchmaker on the planet. He's an independent watchmaker, and I think he's more influential than most of the brands that we've covered on this show. More technically innovative than anyone or almost anything at scale anywhere in the world. And he started making tourbillons at the age of 20 in his uncle's bathroom, and that's a story we'll have to tell someday. He wore the same trousers every day for years while he saved up enough money to build a proper workshop. He invented mechanisms that the Swiss establishment said were unnecessary, impractical, or impossible. And then this guy proved that by making watches that work, all three objections to him were wrong. His watches are made in Geneva in small quantities by a team of watchmakers working on the Journe principle. And the Journe principle we've discussed, but I'm going to reiterate. One watch with one watchmaker, start to finish. One watchmaker, one watch, start to finish. His prices are formidable. I don't claim to have FP Journe money on this podcast. Trust me. Don't break into my house again. I don't have it. The wait lists are real. His relationships to hype are contentious at times, and his technical output is, by any serious measure, one of the most remarkable bodies of work in modern horology. So we have been earning this episode for 18 installments, and next week I think we're going to finally do it justice. And so FP Journe, that's next on our project hit list. All right, so that is episode 18 of What's on Your Restate. If you're British and if you're listening and you felt slightly overlooked in a hobby that talks almost exclusively about Switzerland and Japan and even sneaking in America, I hope this episode was something. The tradition is real, the revival is real, and the people doing the work deserve to be known. If you've ever held a Roger Smith, send me a message, tell me what it was like. To George Daniels, who invented an escapement the Swiss didn't want, trained the one person who could carry it forward, and left his entire workshop to that person when he died, thank you. The craft again is bigger because you refuse to let it shrink. And to the Smiths Everest on my wrist when my son was born, thanks for being there, even if you're on somebody else's wrist right now. I like the one that I have just fine. I'm Wachowski. Take care of yourselves and wear something good. Maybe that watch is going to be a Fears or a Garrick, or Christopher Ward, or something else from our brothers and sisters in Britain.
In a small back room by the bench, a file, a loop, and a patient hand. John Harrison drew the miles to see, made time a tool a man could understand. Thomas Mudge with a watchmaker's fire cut faith into brass, cut doubt away. Each tooth, each jewel, each tiny wheel said stay true, come what may. They kept their word to the metal, kept their nerve to the grain. When the work got hard, they got harder, like rain on a slate roof pane. Stubborn as steel, still standing. Hands of Britain not breaking. Built from the bench, not boasting. Old ways, new ways, waking. Stubborn as steel, still standing. Time after time. From the first small spark to the final tick, they made tradition shine. George Daniels at the lamplit bench, turning genius by the hour. Roger W. Smith carried that torch with quiet grit and private power. Christopher Ward in a modern frame, Fears in the day, Garrick in the night. Smiths on a dial, clear and bold, keeping the old names in sight. Not hurried by fashion, not bent by the loud. They learned from the masters, then stood their ground proud. Stubborn as steel, still standing. Hands of Britain not breaking. Built from the bench, not boasting. Old ways, new ways, waking. Stubborn as steel, still standing. Time after time. From the first small spark to the final tick, they made tradition shine. A nation of hammers and careful lies, of narrow margins and long devotion. Every tiny spring, every polished edge is a promise carried in motion. Not fragile, not fading, just tested and true. What they made with their hands still holds us.